It seems that every day you hear yet another atheist or secularist claiming religions like Christianity are harmful, dangerous, and must be eradicated so humanity can advance into a more enlightened age. Many atheists appear to be on a quest to save humanity from the shackles of the Christian religion, which holds back progress, causes unnecessary violence, and creates a mental health crisis. But what is this belief based on? Hard science backed by countless studies that show the damaging effects of Christianity? No. In fact, the overwhelming amount of research shows the opposite is true, that Christianity is positively associated with numerous benefits that contribute to a healthy society at large. To claim Christianity is harmful is to ignore the science and believe in something with little to no evidence. When I've pointed to studies showing the benefits of Christianity, someone will bring up this or something similar, which purports to show a correlation between increased levels of homicide and religion. If you look at the countries where people report that religion is very important, it appears that they have higher rates of homicide. Thus, it is concluded religion is positively associated with homicide. Some researchers have presented similar correlations in published work. Phil Zuckerman pointed to the fact that states with the highest murder rates tend to be highly religious, such as Louisiana and Alabama. But the states with the lowest murder rates tend to be among the least religious in the country, such as Vermont and Oregon. And paleontologist Gregory Paul published a paper that is highly cited among atheists, which attempts to show that there were numerous negative behaviors and beliefs among countries that were more religious. But how meaningful are these correlations? Everyone knows correlation is not causation. You can find popular graphs all over social media, which show how two things that are totally unrelated are correlated by mere coincidence. If religion is meaningfully correlated with higher levels of homicide, we should expect to find a general trend where higher religiosity aligns with higher rates of homicide. But when we do a visual inspection of these maps, you'll notice there are too many exceptions. For example, the US reports higher levels of importance for religion than Mexico, but has a significantly lower homicide rate. Indonesia reports some of the highest levels of importance for religion, but has low homicide, like that of Australia. Both Egypt and Brazil report the same level of importance for religion, but Brazil has a much higher homicide rate. Russia reports a low level of importance for religion, but has a higher homicide rate than the US, Canada, India, and several other countries that report high levels of religion. In reality, when we look into the details, it appears religion and higher rates of homicide were only correlated some of the time when comparing these two maps. If religion actually had a meaningful correlation with rates of homicide, then the correlation should be present across numerous nations that have different cultures. Instead, it is more plausible the higher levels of homicide are probably stemming from other factors in these countries. After all, when we do a bivariate analysis, you can make just about anything match to fit your conclusion. A bivariate analysis tries to correlate one variable to another without taking into account other variables which could affect the result, like only looking at a state's rate of homicide in religion. But most people are aware that there are other factors and influences that affect a country's homicide rate, like levels of poverty, government corruption, cultural norms, education levels, the funding of the police, gun rights, etc. It is not like religion is the only thing on people's minds. In fact, published research says unemployment and mobility have been found to be among the strongest macro-level predictors of crime. Looking at countrywide or statewide data and trying to draw a meaningful correlation is riddled with limitations, because one tends to ignore all the other factors that could affect a country's homicide rate, and not realize that the cause could be in reverse. What I mean is, some research has indicated that people in low-income areas often have a lot of crime because of poverty and other persistent problems, and therefore often turn to religion for meaning and purpose. To quote from two researchers, the greater social protection, longevity, and health found in wealthy, post-industrial societies and welfare states means that fewer people in these societies regard traditional spiritual values as vital to their lives or to the lives of their community. So instead of religion being the cause of negative effects, like crime and poverty, often living in these conditions causes people to become religious. So there would be a correlation, with the cause being in reverse. Poverty and hard living conditions foster the growth of religion, instead of religion leading to lower quality of life and crime, as some atheists imply. Even if one were still to suggest that religion somehow leads to crime, they would need to show more data to support this. Performing a bivariate analysis of homicide and religion in a country can easily be modified by switching out religion for another variable. Let's go back to Zuckerman's case of comparing US states with levels of homicide, and Gregory Paul's attempt to show countries with more religion are associated with negative effects and behaviors. Zuckerman notes states with low homicide tend to be less religious, but someone could easily correlate the murder rate with another variable. Like, not only are these states less religious, they are also less ethnically diverse. So does having more minorities meaningfully correlate with higher rates of homicide? Couldn't a white supremacist use this same reasoning to argue the more white an area is, the less homicide it has? Gregory Paul implies the US is worse off than most European countries due to higher rates of religion, but Europe also has fewer minorities. A white supremacist could use this exact same reasoning by switching out religion for skin color. Europe has more white people, so surely having white skin meaningfully correlates with lower rates of homicide and other ethical problems. In fact, an actual white supremacist has used this same type of reasoning to erroneously argue the more white a country is, the better off it tends to be. Since the overwhelming majority of atheists are not white supremacists, I think they would reject such a claim, and note there are numerous factors that contribute to a homicide rate. It's just not the level of non-white ethnicities. And I would absolutely agree, because there's nothing special about white skin. But because of this, atheists need to be morally consistent and also stop trying to imply there is a meaningful correlation between religion and higher rates of homicide by merely looking at countrywide or statewide homicide rates and ignoring all the other factors that could be contributing. I could employ this same type of reasoning and show atheism is tied to higher rates of crime. Atheists are more likely to vote Democrat, but crime rates are higher in places where there are more Democrats. So I guess I can say atheism meaningfully correlates with higher rates of crime. If you think this connection is silly and flawed, but the connections that Paul and Zuckerman make are meaningful when they use this exact same reasoning in attempting to correlate religion with negative behaviors, you're not being consistent with the data and cherry-picking bivariate analyses that fit the conclusion you want. You can make anything match if you cherry-pick the variables, ignoring a plethora of other factors that could contribute to behavior and societal problems. Ultimately, if one were to try to use this type of data to claim it shows religion is necessarily harmful, then it would be what statisticians call an ecological fallacy. David A. Friedman says, "The ecological fallacy consists in thinking that relationships observed for groups necessarily hold for individuals. If countries with more fat in the diet have higher rates of breast cancer, then women who eat fatty foods must be more likely to get breast cancer. These inferences may be correct, but are only weakly supported by the aggregate data. It is all too easy to draw incorrect conclusions from aggregate data." Friedman cites several examples. One in particular was a study done in the 1950s, where it was found that the more foreign-born persons a U.S. state had, the higher the literacy was in American English. This was the ecological correlation. But when individuals were looked at, the opposite was found to be true. Native-born individuals were found to be more literate in American English. Friedman notes, immigrants simply tended to live in states where native-born persons were more literate. So trying to draw meaningful correlations from statewide or countrywide data is often limited and can give the wrong impression. It is fallacious to rely only on this type of measure without looking at individuals directly. And similar to this, if an atheist were to point to some negative behavior noted as associated with religion or some religious individuals and try to say the religion was somehow responsible, that is fallacious reasoning. In psychology, this is called an attribution error, when you unjustly attribute an effect to something without good data. An atheist that just lists examples of Christians doing bad things or associations with negative behavior is not proof that Christianity is the cause. One researcher has specifically called out new atheists for committing this error quite often. Now instead, why don't we rely on scientific studies? It's not like there isn't published research on if there's a meaningful correlation between crime and religion. In fact, there's a plethora of data available. In 2001, a meta-analysis compiled an extensive amount. A meta-analysis is not a single study. It takes in all of the studies published across a time period on a specific topic to find the overall general trend. The results of a meta-analysis often can be more reliable because the researchers can combine results from all the studies that have been done on a subject to identify patterns among the various results. What the 2001 meta-analysis found was not that religion was positively correlated with increased levels of crime, but the opposite. Religion appears to be a moderate deterrent of crime. We examined the data from 60 studies, and we found that religion had a statistically significant, moderately sized effect on crime. Our findings give confidence that religion does indeed have some deterrent effect. Now, this is not the only study out there. For example, Phil Zuckerman is aware of this meta-analysis, cites it, and says, although some studies have found that religion does inhibit criminal behavior, others have actually found that religiosity does not have a significant effect on inhibiting criminal behavior. So Zuckerman gives the impression the data is mixed on this issue. But the devil is in the details. First, take a look at his sources. The third one is not a study, but an older edition of a book, The Psychology of Religion, which only notes the limitations of some of this research, and still suggests the data shows that religion is negatively correlated to certain types of criminal behavior. The other two studies that Zuckerman cites, which have results that show religiosity does not have significant effects on inhibiting criminal behavior, were actually already included in the 2001 meta-analysis. So Baer and Wright already included these results into their own research and still found that the overall trend suggests religion is a moderate deterrent of criminal behavior. So this appears to be cherry-picking the data. Not all studies are equal. The meta-analysis took in all the studies across several decades to find the overall trend and found religion as a moderate deterrent of crime. The picture that Zuckerman is painting does not accurately represent the state of the research. Since the 2001 meta-analysis, more research has confirmed this conclusion. In 2010, a systematic review found that 90% of journal articles between 1944 and 2010 report that religiosity protects against antisocial behaviors like crime and delinquency. Only 2 reported religion was positively associated with harmful outcomes. A 2014 study, with a sample size of over 180,000 young adults and adolescents, found that religious involvement was associated with lower rates of drug selling and theft. A 2015 meta-analysis surveyed 62 studies with over 190,000 adolescent participants and found that religion was inversely correlated with alcohol use, illicit drug use, and non-drug delinquency, which was defined as acts such as theft, robbery, assault, and murder. A 2001 study that sampled over 13,000 men and women reported that religious practices, like regular attendance of religious services, bears a strong and statistically significant inverse association with the perpetration of domestic abuse. Religiosity also corresponded with lower levels of direct and indirect aggression. Greater religiosity was also associated with higher levels of compassion and self-control. There is so much literature on this topic, it's hard to deny there is a robust conclusion that religiosity reduces delinquency and criminal activity. As one study put it, religiosity is hypothesized to decrease crime by increasing fear of punishment, conventional bonds, and self-control, and decreasing negative emotional reactions to strains, as well as deviant definitions and peer associations. Previous studies and their synthesis via systematic review and meta-analysis provide empirical support for this hypothesis. Although the religiosity-crime relationship often remains significant after controlling for crime predictors and past criminality, as well as socio-demographic backgrounds. If you believe religion leads to negative behaviors because you looked at statewide or countrywide data and only conducted a bivariate analysis, then you're cherry-picking the data to support the conclusion you want. The science could not be more clear on the actual relationship. Additionally, one paper notes, a large portion of the existing research has largely focused on Western nations, and therefore often relies on subjects from various Christian denominations, more so than other religious backgrounds. So it would be absurd to suggest the benefits discussed so far are not positively associated with Christianity. As another paper put it, as a mainstream religion in Western society, Christianity is typically the religion that is the focus of this type of research. Some atheists who argue religion is associated with crime often bring up that atheists are underrepresented in prison. And so some then suggest you are more likely to end up in prison if you are religious. But this is not presenting a full picture. First of all, studies in the UK and the US demonstrate that Christians are underrepresented in prisons as well. A survey from 538 reports that when groups are broken down, it is Pentecostals that are the least represented in prison. Furthermore, surveys like this do not take into account the rate at which people convert to Christianity or other religions while in prison. As one paper puts it, the rate at which people convert in prison is interesting. It has been reported that prison religious conversions serve as, amongst other things, a coping strategy for those attempting to make sense of their life, as well as seeking forgiveness and reparation. Christian ministries often play an integral role in counseling and rehabilitation for prisoners, which leads to a lower likelihood of convicts becoming repeat offenders. Research indicates religion tends to reduce prison misconduct, improve mental health, and reduce reoffending after release. One study found among prisoners, in some models, that religion correlated with decreased aggression and depression. Using a different model, found that indirect effects of religiosity on state depression and anxiety were significant. And to quote from another paper, several studies have found that the spiritual and religious practices of male and female prisoners help them to have less prison infractions and adjust in a psychologically healthy way to prison life, manage guilt, and find motivation, direction, peace of mind, and meaning in life, as well as hope for the future and support to make a shift in their lifestyle and behaviors. So it's not like being religious means you're more likely to end up in prison. Ending up in prison seems to cause people to convert, which is in line with the previous research that we've already discussed on the effects of religion on crime. Now, some might object and claim that the reason Christianity correlates with positive benefits is not because of one's religious beliefs, but because of other factors, like that churches often create social structures and good communities that could be what really causes an increase in ethical behavior, instead of it being merely Christian beliefs and doctrines. When I debated Matt Dillahunty, this is how he put it.
If someone who reports that they are more religious is less likely to commit a crime, how do we know that religiosity is in fact the motivating thing there? How do we know that it's not having a good family structure, a good social structure, a good community that you're living in, where it's true that churches build communities. They also build hospitals and universities. They do things to help the homeless and other things. And those are certainly positive effects. My view is that those are positive effects of caring people, and they may credit it to their religion. I don't necessarily see that the religion itself is properly attributed as the thing that is doing good.
Now, I'm not going to deny that creating social structures and being a part of a healthy community can lead to more ethical behavior and better mental health. But the research often indicates these factors alone cannot fully explain why religions, like Christianity, are often associated with positive benefits. Take this study from 2010, which compared ritualistic and relational aspects of religion. The study drew on a Christian sample size of adolescents within the US, and found that ritualistic aspects of Christianity have little or nothing to do with actual morality in life, whereas the second focuses on behaviors or beliefs that result from a perceived relational encounter with a supernatural being, precipitating the development of a set of internally motivated beliefs and practices. In other words, relational practice was found to be more of a deterrent of deviant behavior than ritualistic participation. So it was the internal beliefs of Christianity and one's relationship with God that led to less deviant behavior, not external aspects of Christianity. Beyond this, research into the effects of religion often divide up religious individuals based on the reasons as to why they are religious, and this will help shed some light on this question. Some qualify as extrinsically religious. These individuals are religious as a means to an end. One is religious to be a part of a community, or for sociability reasons, or a distraction, or because it is a family tradition. But one does not have to actually believe what the religion teaches. The extrinsic type turns to God, but without turning away from the self. Some qualify as intrinsically religious. These individuals are religious because they want to hold to the core tenets of a religion. Individuals described by an intrinsic orientation make central their religion as the framework for their lives, and they try to consistently live the religion they believe. It is in this sense that he lives his religion. Often, there is a third category called quest orientation, where religion is treated as a search for truth. It focuses less on doctrinal beliefs and more on spiritual development as a journey. These types often describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. If you want to see if the positive benefits associated with Christianity come from core beliefs and doctrines, or from other factors associated with the religion, like social structures and forming communities, then studying the effects of intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity is a good path forward. If more positive benefits are associated with an extrinsic orientation, then the skeptic is right that the benefits do not come from Christian beliefs, but other associated factors. If the benefits are associated with an intrinsic orientation, then many of the benefits of Christianity are associated with the core beliefs and doctrines that then motivate individuals to live more ethical lives. In fact, intrinsically religious individuals are what we traditionally think when we state someone as a Christian. The extrinsically religious identify as Christian for cultural reasons, and not because of religious motivators or a commitment to religious beliefs, as it is with the intrinsically motivated. Extrinsic religiosity is not what one generally means when they say someone is religious. When we dive into the data, it is clear more benefits are associated with intrinsic religiosity. As far back as 1967, Alport and Ross found that intrinsic religiosity was associated with less prejudice than extrinsic religiosity. In 1985, another study found a significant correlation between prejudice and extrinsic religiosity, but not with intrinsic religiosity. A meta-analysis found intrinsic religiosity tends to correlate with desirable variables like mental health, altruism, and religious commitment. The study even directly says, the E-scale does a good job of measuring the sort of religion that gives a religion a bad name. The I-scale correlated positively with other measures of religious commitment, internal locus of control, and purpose in life, and negatively with trait anxiety. A 2002 meta-analysis found that those with an intrinsic orientation correlate with 3 of the big personality traits and did not significantly correlate with the other 2. However, those identified as mature in their religion correlated with 4 of the 5 personality traits and negatively correlated with neuroticism. Whereas, extrinsic religiosity did correlate with neuroticism, while not correlating with the other 4 personality traits one ought to. A meta-analysis from 2003 found intrinsic religiosity was negatively related to depressive symptoms, but extrinsic religiosity was positively associated with depressive symptoms. Another 2003 meta-analysis found that religion was positively associated with better mental health, and that the religiosity mental health correlation becomes stronger as concepts are operationalized in an internal, identifiable manner. In other words, characteristics of intrinsic religiosity were associated with better mental health. A paper from 2009 that surveyed a wide variety of research found that intrinsic religious motivation was associated with higher self-control and self-regulation, whereas extrinsic religiosity was not. The researchers also noted they gathered research predominantly from Christian backgrounds. And a 2017 review of the literature that drew heavily on research with Christian participants found intrinsic religiosity was moderately associated with non-lethal suicidal behaviors. To quote, "It appears therefore that commitment to the beliefs and rituals of Christianity is more of a protective factor for suicidal behavior than the indirect benefits, such as the social relationships that might develop from regular church attendance." Not every study distinguishes between extrinsic and intrinsic religiosity, but as you can see from this sample, a lot of research does. So if you're going to suggest the benefits of Christianity do not come directly from the tenets of Christianity, then once again, you are going against what the scientific data suggests. numerous studies indicate direct benefits from an intrinsic orientation among Christians. To further support this, a meta-analysis found religious priming was associated with numerous pro-social benefits and behavior when studying adherents of Abrahamic faiths. Priming is when researchers divide subjects into a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group in these studies was primed with religious prayer, worship music, a Bible study, or similar methods, and then both groups were studied. What was found was that religious priming has robust effects across a variety of outcome measures, pro-social measures included. In other words, when religious individuals are primed, they tend to display more pro-social benefits, indicating religious beliefs and doctrines likely help promote more ethical behavior, instead of religion merely being associated with ethical behavior, as some skeptics have suggested. Beyond this, we can list more research showing the positive associations of religion. A meta-analysis found religion and spirituality were associated with the overall health of cancer patients. Another found religiosity has an overall protective effect against suicide, with a significant association in Western cultures, which is predominantly Christian. A systematic review found various aspects of religiosity, including Christianity, positively relate with giving to outgroup and secular organizations. Research also indicates one is more likely to volunteer for a charity if they are religious. Results from 53 countries reveal frequent churchgoers are more active in volunteer work, and a devout national context has an additional positive effect. Religious volunteering has a strong spillover effect, implying that religious citizens also volunteer more for secular organizations. And interestingly, the difference between secular and religious people is substantially smaller in devout countries than in secular countries. So the more devout a country is, the more likely secular people will volunteer for charity work. Moving on, a meta-analysis surveyed 850 studies and found that religious involvement is generally associated with greater well-being, less depression and anxiety, greater social support, and less substance abuse. A 2021 meta-analysis found a sizable correlation between the ability to recover from a difficult situation and religiosity. And another found religion and spirituality was a factor that was demonstrably effective. And this is only a sample of the research that shows numerous benefits we see in peer-reviewed studies that draw heavily on Christian participants. Christianity is not harmful, but actually, it is extremely beneficial for humanity and our societies. To quote psychologist Andrew Sims, "The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on mental and physical health is one of the best-kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. If the findings of a huge volume of research on this topic had gone in the opposite direction, and it had been found that religion damages your mental health, it would have been front-page news in every newspaper in the land." Sims was basically right about this last point, as a few years ago, a study was published that looked at children across numerous countries and suggested children are more altruistic if they are raised in non-religious homes. The study was picked up by numerous outlets and cited far and wide.
A new study indicates that religious kids are likely to be less willing to share than their atheist peers.
Amen.
As I like to do as often as possible, let's take a look at any research that may be relevant to this claim. A study published in Current Biology showed altruism to be negatively correlated with religiosity in children. Basically, secular kids were found to be more altruistic than religious ones across multiple countries and cultures.
You're likely to be more moral if you're raised in a secular context. And that's not me speaking, that's this study speaking. Take it up with the authors if you have a problem with it.
There was just one problem. A few years later, the study was retracted due to a serious calculation error. Actually, the country of origin was the primary predictor of the outcomes, not religious affiliation. Yet it appeared this study was given a bigger spotlight by media outlets because it went against the majority of the research that indicates religion in the Western world is associated with numerous positive benefits. Thus, media outlets gave the impression to laymen religion was associated with lower rates of altruism because most only saw this one study, without seeing what the majority of the research indicated. And despite all this research, much of which has been around for years, we still have popular atheists claiming Christianity is harmful and dangerous.
Christianity is dangerous to children because they're told that they're born defective and need to ask forgiveness for even being born at all, and that they'd better not think rationally about that or they'll burn in hell. Intellectually damaging child abuse.
This claim is like many of the assertions I hear from atheists who think Christianity is harmful. They often just state this or something like it without evidence and expect everyone to just accept it. But where is the empirical research that supports such a connection? Where is the evidence that the doctrine of total depravity is intellectually damaging child abuse? If we're going to do experimental psychology from the armchair, then I could just say that Christian teaching of total depravity actually results in humility and causes one to seek to be more altruistic by working to change their sinful nature through the gospel. If I made such a claim, I'm sure a skeptic would demand evidence for such a connection, and rightly so. So when skeptics or atheists make similar claims, all one has to do is ask for the evidence of such a connection. If they cannot provide it, their claim is baseless. As Christopher Hitchens said, what can be asserted without evidence can be denied without evidence. Some have suggested that one could get the same or similar benefits from meditation. But the research on meditation does not appear to suggest that. There are benefits from meditation, but not nearly as much as we see with intrinsic religiosity or Christian religiosity in general. One 2014 meta-analysis found meditation helped improve anxiety and depression, but there was low evidence it helped with stress, improved mental health, one's mood, attention, or substance abuse. Additionally, meditation programs were no better than active treatments, such as the use of drugs or behavioral therapy. Even more damning was a later meta-analysis found meditation interventions had an effect on compassion and empathy, but not on aggression, connectedness, or prejudice. However, compassion levels were only found to increase in individual studies when the meditation teacher was one of the study authors, and when the study only employed a passive control group, but not an active group. Results between the passive and active groups were non-significant, suggesting other forms of active intervention, like watching a nature video, might produce similar outcomes to meditation. The authors highlighted other methodological problems with the research on meditation and concluded, "We found that the effects of meditation interventions on prosociality were limited. The methodological quality of 61% of the studies was graded as weak." Thus, based on the current research, it does not appear meditation can replicate the prosocial benefits of intrinsic religiosity or Christian religiosity in general. But didn't Phil Zuckerman cite several studies that demonstrated religiosity is associated with negative behaviors? In 2019, Zuckerman posted an article in Salon responding to then Attorney General William Barr. Now, he is not claiming religions like Christianity are necessarily harmful like other skeptics do. Instead, he is attempting to establish that secularism doesn't destroy society or the moral order, a topic we do not have time to cover in this video. Many of his arguments were already addressed in earlier sections of this video, but towards the end he says, at least in the US, if not elsewhere, secular people are notably moral in other ways. They are on average less racist, less ethnocentric, less homophobic, less militaristic, less authoritarian, and less likely to hit their children than their religious peers. They are also more likely to support women's equality, reproductive rights, sane gun control, death with dignity, animal welfare, and efforts to fight climate change. Finally, atheists are significantly underrepresented in prison. To be fair, Zuckerman is not directly saying religion leads to these negative traits, only that if you're a secularist, you're more moral in these areas. And despite this, I've dealt with many atheists that take this quote and then use it to argue Christianity correlates with numerous negative behaviors. We've already addressed the issue of religiosity in prison, but what about these other claims? Zuckerman provides links to studies he says supports his conclusions. Some of these are assuming a left-leaning political ideology is already morally superior, which is controversial, so I won't address these. But these other claims, if true, would indicate ways in which religious individuals are less moral. But when we take a look at the links, they do not appear to support Zuckerman's claims. The first link is to a meta-analysis on racism, but it doesn't state secular people are noticeably less racist than all religious individuals. Instead, the study divides subjects up into intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. And at this point, you shouldn't be surprised to find out that it was extrinsic religiosity that was positively associated with racism. And the measures on intrinsic religiosity were pointing in the opposite direction, although non-significant. Non-religious were included in Quest, and the overall results between Quest and intrinsic religiosity were the same. Furthermore, in another fixed model, Quest was more strongly associated with racial tolerance in religious than in mixed samples. In other words, including non-religious in the sample decreased racial tolerance in the fixed model from when the sample only consisted of religious individuals. Now they do note on indirect measures, those with an agnostic or questioning orientation were more racially tolerant. But the problem is such measures are less controllable and less obvious markers of racial prejudice. Matthew DiCarlo says, indirect observables are less straightforward to assess. They are terms whose application calls for relatively more subtle, complex, or indirect observations in which inferences play an acknowledged part. So any strong inference from indirect measures is questionable. The direct evidence in the study did not yield any difference between intrinsic religiosity and the non-religious as part of Quest. And within the Quest group, racial tolerance decreased when the non-religious were included. Thus, these findings converge with the overall pattern of results in our review, with evidence of racism among those who are religious for social conformity reasons, and a lack of evidence that those who are religious for more benevolent reasons are more racially tolerant than the non-religious. Meaning there is no direct evidence those with an intrinsic orientation are more racist than secularists. Additionally, the study noted among the extrinsically religious, racism decreased significantly in recent years, which suggests the correlation could be due to older cultural norms dying out. And the study concludes by noting, we find no relation between the endorsement of religious doctrine specific to the Christian faith and racial prejudice. So the study doesn't really show what Zuckerman implies, that secularists are less racist than all religious individuals. One can only infer non-religious are more racially tolerant than fundamentalists and those with an extrinsic orientation, and even that has been declining in recent years. Next, Zuckerman cites this poll from Pew Research to support his claim that secularists are less ethnocentric in the US. But the poll comes from nations of Western Europe, not the US as Zuckerman claimed. I think what Zuckerman is referring to in the poll is this question on if you think your culture is superior. Practicing and non-practicing Christians were more likely to say their culture is superior than the religious unaffiliated. But there are several limitations to this. First, the poll is nothing more than a bivariate means comparison, which means it only compared religiosity to the results of the question. This doesn't establish much of a statistical relationship. Sampling different nations also yielded different results, which suggests the results might be more related to cultural differences among Western Europeans. Second, the questions in the poll are vague. If someone called me and asked if I thought my culture was superior to others, that would not be a yes or no answer. Superior how? Technologically? Morally? Yes, my culture is morally superior to some cultures, like Nazism or communist nations that are committing genocide. My culture is technologically superior to third world nations, but that doesn't mean my culture is necessarily morally superior. The question could mean different things to different people. The poll also doesn't differentiate between those of intrinsic and an extrinsic orientation, nor does it equate this finding with ethnocentrism. But as we noted, there is some evidence extrinsic religiosity does correlate with prejudice and racism. So how do we not know many of the participants are not just extrinsically religious? No study has found a positive association between ethnocentrism and intrinsic religiosity, and this poll is too limited to suggest a link. Kenneth Vaughan also conducted a study which looked at acceptance of refugees at the individual level, regional level, and national level in Europe, and actually found at the individual level, Christians, with the exception of Catholic Christians and the unaffiliated, are relatively similar in their policy preferences regarding the admittance of refugees. Religious service attendance is associated with more generous policy preferences. But at the national level and regional level, percent unaffiliated is associated with more restrictive preferences, which is contrary to Zuckerman's claim. Additionally, other studies have found similar results. To give one more brief example, a 2017 study looked directly at anti-Muslim sentiment in Western Europe from before the European immigration crisis and found the opposite of what Zuckerman claimed. Our findings indicate that although more secularized countries are on average more tolerant towards Muslims and Islam, strongest anti-Muslim attitudes are nonetheless found among the non-religious in these countries. So there's a lot more data than what has been presented here. Similar issues are present with regards to the polling data cited for women's equality and climate change. The latter does show the unaffiliated are more likely to support environmental regulations. But the poll didn't just ask that. It asked if stricter environmental laws are worth the cost or too costly for jobs in the economy. Christians were more likely to say environmental regulations were too costly. So this poll was not just about wanting to help the environment. It is about weighing costs between the economy and environmental measures. The way Zuckerman represents it is not accurate. I could also just spin the results and say the poll clearly shows that secularists are less likely to care about jobs, people's livelihoods, and creating an economy where people can provide for their families. Furthermore, despite this claim, a study was done in the US, which found the strength of religious identity appeared to increase environmentally friendly consumer behavior. We can assert that there is no evidence that any of our measures of religiosity intensify the negative political conservatism effect. We provide evidence that the strongest negative conservatism effects are found among those who are least religious. This conclusion was backed up by a recent cross-country investigation, which found religion promotes pro-environmental intentions and behavior. The sample size was over 200,000 across 91 countries, collected from 1989 to 2014, and had robust results after running 120 regression specifications. So the evidence indicates religiosity actually leads to pro-environmental tendencies. The poll Zuckerman cites on women's equality doesn't even mention equality or equal rights, but polls people on if they think women should return to their traditional roles in society. Interestingly enough, more Catholics disagree with the statement than those with no religion. Nonetheless, the poll does not suggest those who hold to more traditional gender roles think women's rights should be taken away. One could believe women should have equal rights, but that women should freely choose to be stay-at-home mothers, because the respondents may believe such a lifestyle is superior. The poll question is vague as to the implications, and doesn't necessarily mean you think women should be denied the right to vote or work. With regards to Zuckerman's link on homophobia, it's a very small study that only focused on religious fundamentalism, not intrinsic religiosity, of only 198 individuals in the Bible Belt. Is this really an accurate sample size of Christians at large? Most Christians would not qualify as fundamentalists from the Bible Belt. There are better studies Zuckerman could have cited on this issue. A lot of the research looks into something called Homo Negativity, which can be defined differently between various studies. Generally, it seems to mean having a negative attitude towards homosexuality or LGBTQ lifestyles. It can mean an intellectual disapproval of homosexuality, and sometimes studies look into internalized Homo Negativity among LGBTQ individuals. But as one important study notes, self-reported Homo Negativity does not necessarily correspond to the implicitly existing aversion to homosexuality. Not all Homo Negativity means prejudice or hatred. A Christian who disagrees with a homosexual lifestyle can still think homosexuals and lesbians should be treated with respect and have equal rights, but could still qualify as being partially homo-negative, but not prejudice. This study looked at Homo Negativity across 79 countries and differentiated between extrinsic and intrinsic orientation. It found people who are more intrinsically motivated tend to be less homo-negative. Intrinsically religiously motivated people have higher tolerance. The study also noted numerous cultural artifacts that affect the result. For example, religiosity increases Homo Negativity less strongly in post-communist countries than in other countries. Older people were more homo-negative than younger, as well as those of lower income and lower education. The longer homosexual activities have been compliant with the law, the lower homo-negativity of the citizens. In societies with higher gross domestic product per capita are more tolerant towards homosexuality. it appears a lot of Homo Negativity comes from cultural factors and not necessarily religiosity. This is backed up by other research that indicates much of the LGBTQ prejudice might be mediated by right-wing authoritarianism and traditionalism. In fact, one study notes that beliefs such as right-wing authoritarianism and adherence to traditional values fully mediated the relationship between religiosity and LGBTQ prejudice. To quote, "The factor traditionalism fully mediated the path connecting religiosity and prejudice towards sexual and gender diversity. That is, it reduced the magnitude of the association from 0.3 to negative 0.23. It is not religiosity itself or the degrees of religious practice that motivates prejudice, but rather the degree of adherence to traditional values." In other words, once these other beliefs are accounted for, religiosity negatively correlated with prejudice. But when it comes to Homo Negativity, I'm still willing to grant that secularists are less Homo Negative. Nonetheless, what Homo Negativity can mean will vary from person to person, and doesn't necessarily mean one is prejudiced. Next, Zuckerman cites this article from The Guardian to argue secularists are less militaristic. But it mostly relies on poll data and not studies on intrinsic religiosity. The article presupposes left-wing policies are morally superior, which is something unproven and debatable. For corporal punishment, it relied on an old study that looked at data from 1988, only had a moderate sample size, and only looked at fundamentalists among Protestants. What is more, is it forces a literal interpretation of biblical verses and implies most Christians will also interpret these passages the same way. Most notably, is it never defines what militaristic means or shows such attitudes are necessarily bad. I hope most people would agree that the Allies' militaristic attitudes during World War II was necessary to stop fascism and imperialism. Pacifism is not necessarily the appropriate means for stopping evil or always doing good. So there are a lot of assumptions in this article, and nothing is well defined or defended. As for being more authoritarian, Zuckerman cites this study which is not comparing secularists with intrinsically religious individuals. The paper is studying right-wing authoritarianism and how it could cause prejudice among religious individuals. It does not suggest religiosity leads to authoritarianism. I'm not sure why Zuckerman cited this. The next study he cites is wildly taken out of context. It does not say one is less likely to hit their children if they are not religious. It only surveyed about 3,000 parents of children aged 12 and younger from 50 mid-sized California cities. What it found was, parents who attend religious groups use corporal punishment more frequently than parents who did not attend religious groups. But also, those who lived in counties with greater rates of religious participation use corporal punishment less frequently than those living in counties with lower rates of religious participation. There were no effects for religious participation on physical abuse at the individual level or county level. The study only looked at one small geographical region, has very limited implications, and it was taken wildly out of context. In truth, we should be skeptical of people who cite one individual study and do not rely on a collection of studies or meta-analyses. It's very easy to cherry-pick the data to fit the conclusion you want. For example, this systematic review looked at 444 studies on depression and religiosity, and found that most show religion and spirituality are negatively correlated with depression. But 6% reported greater depression levels among religious individuals, which is about 26 studies. So couldn't someone just write an article or make a video claiming that over 25 studies have indicated religion is associated with higher levels of depression? It would sound impressive, but it would be cherry-picked data. Likewise, when an atheist, a secularist, or anyone for that matter, cites one individual study or one bivariate comparison that seems to support the conclusion they have, we should be skeptical. Always check the source and don't let your opponent make a claim they cannot back up without evidence or sufficient reasoning. In conclusion, if you're not religious or you're an atheist and you're on a crusade to save humanity from the shackles of Christianity, that you must deconvert as many as possible to save us all from the tyranny of the gospel, just stop. your motives are misplaced and based on unscientific beliefs about the effects of Christianity. You're not saving anyone from a harmful belief system. I don't find it odd when atheists want to discuss the philosophy of religion and voice their disagreements over the nature of reality. These types of conversations are interesting to people of many backgrounds. But when atheists go in the direction of also claiming that Christianity is harmful and the world would be better off without it, in reality, they have no good evidence to support such a fantasy. The overwhelming amount of research shows Christianity is extremely beneficial for mental health, ethical behavior, and a healthy society. There is no evidence it leads to more aggression, war, crime, or
intellectually damaging child abuse.
Nor do we truly know the full result of what would happen if Christianity became an extinct religion. There is insufficient data to suggest society would remain the same or improve, as some have speculated. Thus, the crusade some atheists are on to eradicate Christianity is based on flawed and unscientific motives. It truly is to have faith
in something without evidence.